Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. It is November 11th, 2024. I'm your host, Nate Pike. We have so very much to talk about tonight, including fixing, apparently, audio issues on the fly. Hopefully they're working now. We got a lot to talk about. You guys just missed because apparently the sound wasn't turned on. I was soliloquizing. New word, just made it up, about the demise of the Twitter. Hopefully we're going to be able to have a little bit of a Twitter Spaces thing going on after we do our weekly rundown of Alberta politics. Hopefully there's one or two people still left in the Twitter sphere who are going to have some thoughts, but it's been wild watching the demise of Twitter over the last couple of days, ever since a certain victory that happened in the United States. The quality of the if it is such a thing is even possible, the quality of the discourse on Twitter has dropped way down, but it is currently the only way that we have to really do the anonymous live call-in stuff. So we're going to keep with the spaces for the time being, and hopefully people keep enough of their accounts that they'll be able to tap in for at least our weekly little things that happened in Alberta politics this week. We're going to get started right off the bat with some changes that have been made to trapping limits in a province where we're going to send people out with their very best of intentions to kill grizzly bears for no discernible reason other than some people just like to kill big things. We saw this week that the Alberta Forestry and Parks has lifted or removed fur-bearing trapping limits for the 2024-2025 season, including for, and this is wild. We tried to see if we could get the Hugh Jackman or the Ryan Reynolds to maybe weigh in, because in Alberta it turns out that there's a lot of evidence that very strongly suggests that wolverines are in fact at risk, and these trapping restrictions being lifted, they include the trapping of wolverines. From the article that we have on the screen here, the new regulations for this trapping season, approved by Alberta Forestry and Parks Minister Todd Loewen, remove limits in areas where open season currently exists, including for wolverine, lynx, fisher, and river otter. A zero harvest remains in only a couple of trapping zones, but for lynx and wolverines, in zones where they don't actually live. So for the lynx and the wolverines, unless they move to one of those areas where the no trapping zones still exist, it doesn't apply to them. So that's not great at all. We're just starting with the happy right out of the gates tonight. Moving on from there, the fraught relationship between the province of Alberta and Alberta municipalities continues to fraughten, because one of the stories that came out of the last couple of weeks was on November 5th. And this is where the president of the rural municipalities of Alberta raised the alarm that municipalities could be going bankrupt in 5 to 10 years. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for that reality. The reasons that are listed off in the article: aging infrastructure, a new police force in addition to the RCMP, and boy, you'd better believe we're going to talk about the policing in just a little bit. Oil and gas companies owing millions in unpaid taxes to municipalities. Now, this has been an ongoing issue in the province of Alberta, where municipalities have been saying, hey, we'd really like to get those property taxes from the people who are supposed to be paying them, those oil and gas companies. And the oil and gas companies are going, what if we just declare bankruptcy and then we don't pay them? Ha ha. And then the municipalities are just screwed. Or oil and gas companies just choose not to pay their property taxes, in which case the municipalities are also still just screwed. So there's revenue streams that are supposed to be coming in that municipalities aren't getting access to. But as even we saw in the city of Calgary over the summer, and it still blows my mind that if there's a thing that highlights how old some of the infrastructure in Calgary actually is, I go back to our conversation with former city councillor Jeremy Farkas, where he highlighted during the crisis where we had the pipes that were bursting, that there are still water pipes in Calgary that are made of wood. I just don't know what to do with that. So there's no question that there's some aging infrastructure that needs to be addressed. But as the province continues to whittle away at the ways that municipalities can access funds, and as some corporations are not acting in the best of faith, there's going to be a theme here tonight. It's very difficult for municipalities to get the money to pay for those things, especially when they're buying new arenas. So there's that. Moving on from there and getting into some of the bigger stories from the week, we saw the federal government released their regulations for emissions caps. And this gets complicated really quickly. We're going to try to do our best to kind of parse out the gist of it. But basically what happened is on Monday, the federal government, they've been talking about emissions caps for quite some time. They unveiled regulations that are going to say, hey, any greenhouse gases, we're going to put a cap on them in the oil and gas sector. And it's going to limit emissions to 35% below the 2019 levels. So not only is it the federal government saying, hey, we've got to stop the emissions, the federal government is actually saying, hey, you know what, we're putting out more emissions than we were historically, so we need to get those emissions levels down. We need to get them to below 2019 levels. We need to get them 35% below 2019 levels, and we need to do that in 4 years. So the federal government says that it's emissions only, and it also says that it expects oil and gas to be able to still produce and actually increase production by 16% above 2019 levels by 2030 to 2032 through technically feasible ways of reducing the emissions. So the federal government's position is, hey, you know what? This is doable. We need to show some leadership on this, and when you take a look at where Alberta sits on emissions for the rest of Canada, not great. But we need to show some leadership on this. We need to get this done. Now, Daniel Smith in the UCP have been saying ever since these regulations were first whispered about that this emissions cap was unattainable. Couldn't be done. We don't have the technology. We don't have the will. And the emissions cap would be a de facto production cap. Now, obviously, there's some debate going on here because we've got the federal government saying, no, they'll still be able to increase production by 16%. And we've got the province saying, but our business daddies are unhappy. And that really shined through at the press conference that Danielle Smith had with her two favorite minions right after the regulations were announced.
Premier, I'm just wondering what you expect a timeline would be if you were, and do you plan to take this to court? Because we just were hearing, I think it was last week, we talked about the carve-outs, and that took a year for you to take to judicial court.
Well, as soon as possible. I mean, I'll get my justice minister working on it immediately, and we'll start drafting a motion under the Sovereignty Act immediately as well.
Danielle Smith said Sovereignty Act. Drink. If that's your jam. If it's not, that's okay too. Perhaps enjoy a leftover Halloween candy every time Danielle Smith says Sovereignty Act, because she says it a lot this week. For a reminder for everyone, the Sovereignty Act was Danielle Smith's centerpiece of her leadership race. And the way that she pitched it at the time was that it was going to put up a shield. It was going to put up a firewall that would stop the federal government from enacting federal legislation, even though that's not how laws in Canada work. But a lot of people really liked the idea of provinces just being able to say, hey, you know what? We don't want to do that law that you've made for all of Canada because we think we know better. So we're just not gonna. And it's also important to highlight that there are existing mechanisms by which provinces can contest laws. In fact, Danielle Smith in the UCP and even Jason Kenney with the UCP took the federal government to court over more than a couple of matters. And on some of them, they were able to force the federal government to have to make adjustments or changes to legislation. So the mechanisms work. There's no question about that. But they don't work in a perhaps fast or dramatic enough way for Danielle Smith and the base that she continues to just shovel the red meat to. So she introduced the Sovereignty Act. But the first iteration of the Sovereignty Act that was introduced in the legislature and what it eventually became were two very, very, very difficult beasts. The first iteration had a bunch of things that were wildly illegal and wildly unconstitutional, which is ironic given Danielle Smith's professed love for the all things constitutional. She had to water it down quite a bit. And we haven't heard very much on the Sovereignty Act in the meantime and in between time, because it is, in just about every way, a paper tiger. It doesn't actually have any strength or force. But Danielle Smith leaned into the Sovereignty Act very, very hard. And what's fascinating about how she leaned into it this week is that despite the legislation that she introduced to the legislature that did get passed, not being anything like the legislation that she campaigned on, she was talking about it this week like it was exactly what she campaigned on.
In whatever way you draft a Sovereignty Act thing, is the Sovereignty Act basically the end result of however you phrase the Sovereignty Act move? Is it to make sure that this emission cap does not come into force in Alberta? Is that sort of the end game with a Sovereignty Act move?
Well, look, think of it as a notwithstanding clause on illegal federal action. The federal government does not have the right to legislate in our area of jurisdiction any more than I have the right to legislate in their area of jurisdiction. So we're putting up a notwithstanding clause saying you're not going to be able to do this because this is our jurisdiction, and we'll put the details into how we intend to fully defend our jurisdiction when we...
Okay, so not a thing. Not a thing. And it's scary, quite frankly, that Danielle Smith would talk about the Sovereignty Act as a notwithstanding clause, especially given some of the legislation that she's brought forward. We'll do the notwithstanding clause again. The short version of what the notwithstanding clause is it's a clause that was written into the Constitution that says, hey, there's this thing called the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But I, as a province, I want to disregard some people's human rights. I want to disregard the fundamental human rights that are guaranteed to all Canadians in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I'm going to invoke the notwithstanding clause. Now, the notwithstanding clause can only be used on these sorts of human rights issues. This is why we see the last time that the notwithstanding clause was used in the province of Alberta was, I think it was 1999, 2000, when Ralph Klein invoked it in order to try to block gay marriage. That's the kind of thing that the notwithstanding clause is. So one would think Danielle Smith, being the Premier of Alberta, would have some understanding of what the notwithstanding clause is. It's not a way that the federal government can shield itself from the provinces. It's, in fact, a way that provinces can trample on the human rights of Canadians. That's why we've seen the notwithstanding clause invoked in some provinces across Canada in regards to trampling on the rights of trans individuals in particular. So the notwithstanding clause is a giant way of saying, yeah, I'm just going to crap all over somebody's human rights because I wanna. It's not to be used for economic reasons. And for Danielle Smith to try to invoke the notwithstanding clause or the idea of the notwithstanding clause to do with the Sovereignty Act is just patently false. We've heard from legal scholars ever since Danielle Smith first started talking about the Sovereignty Act that the way that she wanted to propose using it simply wouldn't work. There was no mechanism. There are federal laws and there are provincial laws, and federal laws, on the balance of most things, override provincial laws. So to say that a law that the province created, called the Sovereignty Act, was somehow going to allow the province of Alberta to opt out of economic or environmental areas that, by the way, the Supreme Court of Canada has said the federal government does have the jurisdiction to legislate on. Whoops. Ignoring that fact, it's still not what she's talking about. It's a very confusing thing that she does, talking about the notwithstanding clause there. But that wasn't all that she had to say at that press conference, because she's got, for anybody who's been paying attention to Alberta politics for any length of time, you probably know she's got a bit of an axe to grind with the environment minister, the federal environment minister, Stephen Guilbeault. And she, for somebody who wants people to stay in their lane, she has some fascinating ideas as to what kind of jurisdiction Stephen Guilbeault has.
Stephen Guilbeault also said that basically you, Pierre Poilievre, and Scott Moe don't believe in climate change. What do you have to say to that?
That is just absolute nonsense. And he continues to say such things because he's trying to demonize our province, and he's trying to demonize our sector, and he's trying to justify unconstitutional policy. And it's absolutely unacceptable. We expect our national leaders to engage in nation building as opposed to nation destruction. And that is what they are doing by having a particular type of emissions cap targeted to our particular industry that is going to impact our particular province for no other reason than to be vindictive. And that's what's got to stop. We have always said that we are prepared to work with the federal government, and we have worked with them on the Dow Chemical Project, on the Air Products Project, on the Heidelberg Project. And so there is absolutely no justification for this other than because they think they can get away with it, and they can't.
So you think, and I quote, that it's a deranged vendetta? You don't think it's for the common good, for fighting climate change?
Absolutely not. If he was working towards the common good, he would be working with us on a strategy to reduce emissions over time by 2050, so that we can make sure that we're adopting the best available technology, giving the time for the industry to develop that, develop the market so that we can export our product to reduce emissions nationwide. Heck, if we were to reduce the reliance China has on coal-fired plants with our clean-burning LNG, just 20% conversion of their coal plants would be net zero for Canada. It would remove the equivalent of the same amount of emissions of our entire country. Those are the kind of things that he should be focused on, and instead he's trying to shut down our industry, and we see it.
He's the Minister of Environment for China. He's Minister of Environment for Canada.
Well, he's on a national panel in China that he went to a year ago. He seems to think it's okay for China to have a 2060 target and for him to engage in advising them, meanwhile asking us to achieve unachievable emissions targets. He should be putting Canada first. He should be putting Alberta as.
Now, there's so much to unpack there. And we're going to try to unpack a little bit of it because it's just so much fun. First of all, if we go back to the beginning of that clip, the question was, Stephen Guilbeault says that Danielle Smith and a couple other premiers don't believe in climate change. What do you say to that? And it's nice to see Danielle Smith take a clear position that that's ridiculous. She absolutely does believe in climate change. So that's, fascinating. She didn't say that before her AGM. But what are you going to do? But there's some other pieces in there that she immediately follows up with by trying to say that by saying Danielle Smith doesn't believe in climate change. And, Danielle Smith can say that she believes in climate change, but she certainly isn't taking any meaningful policy decisions, cough, Grousey Mountain coal mine cough, to try to address climate change. If anything, she's doing everything she can to pump the brakes on any sort of meaningful policies to address climate change in order to let oil and gas do basically whatever they want to do, see the property taxes issue that we talked about in the very beginning of the show. But the way that she says, no, Stephen Guilbeault, by saying that I don't believe in climate change, he's trying to demonize Alberta as a province. If that's the logic, I'd like to be very clear here. Here at The Breakdown, when we criticize Danielle Smith and her policies, we're not demonizing Alberta. In fact, we're not demonizing anyone. We're saying Danielle Smith has terrible policies that are hurting people and hurting the province. That's to try to say, I am Alberta, if you say anything bad about me, you're saying something bad about the province, is, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of authoritarian and not a great look. To say that it's demonizing the sector, to say that Danielle Smith doesn't believe in climate change. It appears that Danielle Smith aligns more with the sector of oil and gas than she does the actual province, because nowhere in that question was there any reference to oil and gas. The question was, hey, Danny, do you believe in climate change? Stephen Guilbeault says you don't. And she responds by saying, they're saying mean things about oil and gas. Nowhere in there did anybody say anything about oil and gas. So it's kind of wild. The other piece that she talks about is, if only Stephen Guilbeault influenced the policy of China more, what with his being on a panel once a year. If only he could change the economic direction of China and ship more liquid natural gas there. Now, there's a lot of problems, and I'm going to grossly oversimplify this. But when you take a look at the way that China's energy economy is evolving, there's a lot of people that are making the argument that China is actually going to go from coal and blow right past a lot of the intermediary energy sources like natural gas and immediately pivot to renewables. Now, it's going to take a longer period of time because, and this might be a shock to the Premier of Alberta, China is very large. There are many people living there who have a lot of energy demands. And so transitioning an entire country is a little bit different than asking a single industry to, hey, do a little bit better. You did great in 2019. Maybe you can do that still and still have that 16% increase. It's interesting. But where the press conference got really wild. Oh, one other thing that I wanted to say first before we get on to the next clip. The Stephen Guilbeault should be putting Canada first. I mean, yeah, no problems there. Stephen Guilbeault should be putting Alberta first as a province. That's a fascinating policy stance from the Premier of Alberta. Stephen Guilbeault is the Environment Minister of Canada, but he should be putting Alberta first as a province. And let's not forget that any time that you put region first, there's some history behind phrases like that. That history is not great. It's very powerful. And we've certainly seen some of that power come through in the last election in our poor neighbors south of the border. But that sort of nationalistic rhetoric has some very deeply problematic components to it. This is the root of MAGA. This is the root of the people in Eastern Canada who showed up with the mass deportations now banner. That's where that kind of nationalism goes. So it's other than the fact that it's a little wild that Danielle Smith is making the argument that the Environment Minister of Canada should be putting Alberta first. So many questions. But that nationalistic rhetoric causes a lot of problems. But we're getting to the fun stuff now. This might be my second most favorite Danny clip of all time for what she argues.
To move ahead on the CCUS project when the draft regulations have now come out that you obviously are opposed to?
Well, it's a very good question, isn't it? How are you supposed to participate in good faith with a partner who hammers you over the head when your back is turned? That's how we feel today. We've been sitting with them, having regular bilateral meetings throughout the course of the last year and a half, as I committed to doing. And every single time, Stephen Guilbeault comes out and he comes up with a bludgeon. And so how are we supposed to have some meaningful conversations to work together on a shared purpose? I think he's destroyed the trust. And so I'll have to consult with my ministers about.
Danielle Smith complaining, it's so frustrating. how do you have a conversation with somebody who's so unpredictable, who refuses to deal in good faith? Danielle Smith, who brought in the renewables moratorium out of nowhere. Danielle Smith, who said to Dr. Paul Parks when he was president of the AMA that they were going to get the physician pay model in immediately. And since then, Danielle Smith has said, just kidding, it'll be in budget 2025. You're just going to have to wait. At a time when the province is hemorrhaging doctors, literally saying one thing and doing the total opposite. Danielle Smith, who when asked in the last provincial election if she was going to do anything with the Alberta pension plan or with the Alberta police force, and who responded by saying, I'm not campaigning on the Alberta pension plan, and I'm not campaigning on an Alberta provincial police force. Meanwhile, she continues to push forward with an Alberta pension plan, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of Albertans want nothing to do with it. And she is on the record in multiple places saying that she has made a new provincial police force out of the sheriffs. Danielle Smith is the master of bad faith. And it's particularly funny because I've done a couple of rants about Danielle Smith and the UCP dealing almost exclusively in bad faith, and how that makes them impossible to deal with over the last month and a half. So for her to come out this week and basically steal my rant, I feel like the breakdown should be owed some residuals or something. It's wildly entertaining. But, you got to have good faith, because if orders of government don't treat each other well, then how is another order of government supposed to relate to them? And this is where this next clip gets to be so good as a follow-up.
Planner, so Women and Gender Equality and Youth Minister Marcy Eames said she has deep concerns of the gender identity bills you're bringing forward. What do you think about that?
Well, look, I mean, I haven't read her letter. I know that she has sent it, and I will look it over, and I'll respond to her. But we know what we're doing is to protect kids, to protect their right to make their own choices as adults on changes to their body that are just going to foundationally change their ability to have kids. That's an adult decision, and so we're just giving them the time to be able to grow up and be able to make those kinds of decisions. That's the spirit that is put forward in. Okay.
Ian has requested a meeting with you about the gender identity bills. Will you take the meeting with her? Why or why not?
Again, I'll have to have a look at her letter. I'm not planning on being in Ottawa anytime soon. I don't know if she's planning on being out here. I think she's an Ontario MP, but I'll read her letter.
It's so hard to hear the end of those clips and not do the 5 seconds of laughter, because it's so ridiculous. And it's especially ridiculous when you take a look at what the letter actually was. So again, this is the federal order of government saying to the provinces, hey, I'm going to send you a letter. We would love to have a meeting to discuss these policies. I love Danielle Smith's, well, I'm not going to be in Ottawa because apparently Zoom isn't a thing. Hey, I wonder how almost all of her ministers have delivered their Senate testimony over the last several months. Oh, right. They did it over video. But what's the letter? Well, we could take a look at it, because conveniently the day after Marcy Eames sent it, she posted it to social media. Now, again, that press conference was on November 4th. So we're talking 3 whole days after the date that the letter was sent, because if we take a look at the date on the letter, it was November 1st, 2024. And the Marcy Eames, the Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth, brings forward some very real concerns, as pretty much everybody who wasn't at the UCP AGM have, in regards to Danielle Smith's anti-trans policies. From the letter, you say, and you support and uplift children who identify as trans and gender diverse, but this legislation does the opposite. To focus on the most vulnerable groups in our society is beyond disappointing. Your government continues to validate anti-trans, anti-2S LGBTQI+, and homophobic rhetoric. The legislation presented this week will diminish the rights of trans and gender diverse kids and have serious impacts on the mental and physical health of youth in Alberta. This is not a question of protecting parental rights. In fact, this is undermining undermining parental rights by taking sensitive and important decisions away from families. We should be centering the rights and voices of children and youth, and none of this legislation will. There's more to the letter, but that is a letter from a minister at the federal level to the premier of Alberta that, again, was posted on social media the day after it was sent. Letters dated November 2nd, posted to social media on, letter sent November 1st, posted to social media November 2nd. The minister tagged Danielle Smith in the post. So even if Danielle Smith didn't read her email to that in the space of 3 days, which is, for the record, kind of alarming, because if the federal government is reaching down to the province and saying, hey, guys, we got this thing, love to chat, hit us up when you have a minute. And Danielle Smith says, I couldn't be bothered to read the letter. What else is falling through the cracks? Because she didn't seem to know what the subject matter of the letter was. She said that she didn't even know what was in the letter. So what other letters from the federal government are being sent to the premier of Alberta, and she just can't be bothered to read them, or her staff can't be bothered to brief her on them, or the most logical explanation, she read the letter and she's just lying. I wonder which one it is. It's just embarrassing. Moving on from there. We got to talk about, and this is another one. This is one that people are really, the reactions are really quite fascinating, because people really seem to be struggling with this. We've been talking about the notion that the province of Alberta promised in multiple different Muslim venues that they were going to be bringing halal mortgages to the province. Now, as we said before, there's some problems with that. The first problem is they're already here. There's places that Muslims can go to get halal mortgages from. For anyone who's unfamiliar with halal mortgages, it just basically means a mortgage that is compliant with Sharia or Muslim law. Halal means good. Sharia is the Muslim law part. So a halal mortgage follows Muslim law or Sharia law. There's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And the basic idea is you can't collect interest on loans. That goes against the laws of Islam to collect interest on loans. And that's fine. It also means that there are certain areas that you can't invest money in. And again, in the private sector, totally fine. If there's an organization that says, hey, you know what, we want to make sure that we're only investing in halal investments, we don't want to invest in anything that goes against Islam, then that's what we're going to do. That's fine, because that's a private business doing that with their private money. And presumably they're making good money on the fees that they're charging on halal mortgages. So again, it exists in the private sector. There's nothing wrong with halal mortgages as a product. Want to be really, really clear about that. But Danielle Smith made a bunch of promises to the Muslim community about bringing in halal mortgages and bringing in Muslim statutory holidays in the run-up to the last election. And a lot of people have been very critical of the fact that she hadn't done anything on that. Well, we saw this change, because on November 4th, the finance minister managed to find his way out of a skybox, and he managed to bring forward some of these things. And it gets really interesting really quickly, because one of the things that is happening with the halal mortgages is they changed the legislation in two ways. In one way, they changed the legislation to allow credit unions to set up separate corporations in order to provide halal mortgages. Now, again, private business, doing private business things, no problems there. But they also changed the legislation for Alberta Treasury branches. And as we've discussed on the show before, Alberta Treasury branches is a crown corporation, which means that it is owned by the people of Alberta. The expectation of a crown corporation, especially an investment corporation, is that they're doing everything they can to maximize profits, to maximize return on investment with all of the money they have available. Well, the new legislation allows Alberta Treasury branches to create separate corporations that don't. They'll provide halal mortgages, and they won't invest in areas that could potentially have high rates of return, but would be objectionable to members of the Muslim faith. They would go against Sharia law. They would not be halal. And this is where it gets complicated, and where our last topic tonight gets to be particularly relevant, because the argument from the UCP appears to be, you know what? We want to make sure that, despite the fact that we're all libertarians and we're free market folks, we're going to provide a product through the Alberta Treasury branches, which is a crown corporation. We're going to potentially sacrifice return on investment in order to provide a product that's already on the market. Don't need to take it from me. Why were the corporations created? Well, Nate Horner said it himself.
Can you explain the subsidiary part of this and essentially why that's needed?
Without getting into too much detail, I'd say that when through this mass consultation that the department did, it was found that may be the best path to reach some of the theological considerations of who's offering them.
There it is. So crown corporations are going to be creating subsidiaries in order to meet the theological desires of a certain segment of Albertans. Now, again, I want to be super clear. There is nothing wrong with halal mortgages. There is nothing wrong with members of the Muslim faith saying, I would like to get a halal mortgage. Where it gets questionable is when taxpayer dollars are seeing a potentially decreased return on investment because there are areas that money can't be invested in. And Nate Horner, as you heard himself say, is making these changes not because of economic reasons, but because of theological reasons. And as soon as you have theological reasons guiding the decisions of government, things get problematic real quick. Now, as has been pointed out by many pundits on the social media machines, this is not the first time that the government of Alberta or Canada has engaged in, well, we're going to funnel money towards certain religious institutions. Mustard Seed is one of the big examples that comes up all the time. It's a homeless shelter that has a very, very strong religious bent. But it's different, because this isn't the government of Alberta saying we're going to give money to organizations. This is now the government of Alberta saying we're going to be the organization. And that's a significant change in tone, because the question that you then have to ask yourself is if it's acceptable for the government of Alberta to create corporations to make investment decisions based on theological reasons. Would it be okay if they did it with other faiths? If the government of Alberta all of a sudden decided to invest purely for Christian reasons, or purely for Jewish reasons, or any other faith, would that be okay? And the most rational answer is no. It wouldn't, and it shouldn't be. But Danielle Smith is pandering for votes. She was pandering for votes. She's now doing it again. And it's something that every Albertan should be paying very, very close attention to. Other things that Albertans should be paying very close attention to was there was another announcement this week in regards to the legislature. Apparently, it's just a little bit too roomy up in there. So they're adding some seats. For anybody who's unfamiliar, the legislature currently has 87 seats. 87 MLAs represent all of the people from across Alberta. But Mickey Amory came out and he said, you know what? I think we need some more MLAs. I think we need to expand the number of MLAs. And there's an argument to be made, and it's a good one, that having more representation in the legislature isn't a bad thing, especially with the growing population. It's the way that he wants to see the MLAs picked that's particularly problematic. Because one of the other things that's going to be happening with this whole process of electoral change is they're going to be redrawing the boundaries for constituencies across Alberta. Now, historically, when they redraw the constituency boundaries, you see little changes. Nothing huge. And there's some rules that guide how those changes are supposed to happen. And it's supposed to be arm's length. Mickey Amery is not supposed to be able to influence how those, no member of government is supposed to be able to influence how those boundaries get drawn, because as soon as government gets to, then we get real close to something called gerrymandering, which is the creative drawing of electoral boundaries to ensure that certain seats stay with certain parties. And this is where some of Mickey Amery's comments got to be more than a little problematic.
Well, population is always a primary factor. I'll begin with that. But certainly the fact that our province is growing faster than any other province in the country is an important consideration. One of the things that we also considered was the relative geographic size, for example, of some of the rural MLAs and the challenges that all of our rural MLAs are facing in terms of distance, travel distances. Safety was a consideration as well for me personally. We have MLAs all across this province that are traveling, some of them 4 hours to get from end to end, and in the wintertime, especially in northern Alberta, for example, that could be treacherous. We'd like to give the Commission as much flexibility as possible. And I think we've got a well-grounded reason for moving from 87 to 89 based on the population growth alone. But there are also a number of other changes in the Act that will provide for flexibility when the Commission contemplates.
As we'll see, Mickey Amery really likes the word primary, because the primary decision for how the boundaries should be drawn should be population growth. But also, oh man, there's some constituencies in northern Alberta where people are really, really, really spread out because a lot of it is farmland. It's also very cold, where for an MLA to travel from one end of their constituency to the other, they have to drive like 4 hours. That's a very long drive because no Zoom, I guess. Here's the thing. Anybody who runs in a constituency should presumably know what the map is. And given the generous allowances that are made for travel within a constituency, it's not like they're getting out of pocket for it. So the notion that this has to do with geography and we're really, really worried about northern Alberta starts to be a little telling, but especially when Mickey Amery starts to repeat himself.
We've got 2 additional seats coming forward, and we have a number of amendments being made to the criteria that the Electoral Boundaries Commission can review. With that, a finite piece of land in the borders of Alberta. With 2 additional seats, inevitably, one would expect that the constituencies might be reduced in size. One of the guiding principles I hope the Commission takes into consideration as well is the geographic size along with population. I can't stress enough to you the rigors of this particular job and some of the challenges of traveling in northern Alberta or elsewhere for that matter. We're all from Alberta, and we know that sometimes the weather doesn't cooperate with us. Giving the opportunity for the Commission to contemplate not just population growth, but all of the factors that we talked about earlier, along with I think a primary consideration of geography is just as important as all of the other criteria that we're putting forward here in this amendment.
So we got to have a primary consideration for population. We want to make sure the constituencies and the seats are in areas where it all balances out. It's all equal. We don't want to give anyone uneven advantages. But also, we have to have the primary consideration of distances. So we've got the primary consideration of population, and we've got the primary consideration of geography. And Amery is standing up there saying that, boy, he really, really hopes. The Minister of Justice is standing up there saying, boy, he really, really hopes that the Commission considers these things. So what are the changes? Let's take a look. Because when we take a look at what those changes actually are, it's not just, we flipped a couple of things around. There's some pretty big changes that are going on. There's some deletions. And there's some additions. So what are the things that the commission should consider? Under the new legislation, sparsity, density, and rate of growth of the population, communities of interest, including municipalities, regional and rural communities, Indian reserves, and Métis settlements, geographical features, the availability and means of communication and transportation between various parts of Alberta, the desirability of understandable and clear boundaries, and any other factors the commission considers appropriate. What were the old rules? The requirement for effective representation as guaranteed by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Whoops, deleted that. Sparsity and density of population. Not entirely deleted. They added the rate of growth. Common community interests and community organizations, including those of Indian reserves and Métis settlements. Whenever possible, the existing community boundaries within the cities of Edmonton and Calgary. That has been deleted. Wherever possible, the existing municipal boundaries. That has been deleted. The number of municipalities and other local authorities. That has been deleted. Geographical features, including existing road systems. That's been deleted. The desirability and understanding of clear boundaries, well, they left that part in, so that's super fun, at least. So what Mickey Amery is doing with these changes is he's removing the protections that exist to make sure that municipalities and large municipalities have their own representation. And the question came up, is this really just to dilute rural voters into urban voters to delete the progressive votes that tend to be in the bigger cities?
This is a bad faith question, but it's not about drowning the urban progressive voters with rural voters, in your opinion.
Well, it's not just my opinion. I think that many jurisdictions are adopting this approach because it gives better representation, more effective representation. In fact, some of the wording in the amendments were taken directly out of the case law and the jurisprudence on electoral boundaries. This is something that we're trying to do to reflect what Alberta is moving towards, and that is the most innovative province in Canada, the best place to live, and certainly connected in multiple ways, not just by roadways, but via virtual means and otherwise. So no, I would say to you that other provinces, other jurisdictions have adopted this language. We've received the direction from our courts, both here and elsewhere, and the language that we're adopting is very consistent with language that is being recommended in both the jurisprudence and that has been adopted by various provinces.
Now, what's fascinating about that particular little bowl of word salad is what he seems to be saying is, A, all the kids are doing it, or all the cool kids are doing it. But my favorite part about that particular bowl of word salad is when he says, you know what? We're trying to reflect how innovative and the very many ways that Albertans connect with each other, like virtually. So his whole argument is we need to make sure that those seats, maybe they get in the northern Alberta area because driving's hard. And then he says, no, it's cool because we're all virtually connected anyways. And this is the problem with these UCP ministers who don't seem to have any real grasp of the subject matter that they're talking about because they contradict themselves constantly. If you're going to make an argument that you want to have more seats in rural Alberta, then just say, you know what? No, we want to have more seats in rural Alberta. We think that it's important that rural Alberta has more representation because historically, the way that the electoral game has worked in the province of Alberta, as Ralph Klein famously said, is you got your three-legged stool. And as long as you have two legs of the stool, whether it's Calgary or Edmonton, then you can win an election. So we want to balance it out a little bit because, Calgary and Edmonton hold overwhelmingly the majority of the population of the province, but there's a lot of people in rural Alberta who want to see their way of life protected. So we're going to give them 2 extra seats. And if the NDP want them, they can come and get them. If the NDP believe their values are reflective of rural Alberta, then they shouldn't have any problems capturing those seats. That's what a free democracy is for. They could just say that, but instead they have to try to bullshit their way through it. And every time they try to bullshit their way through it, they end up tripping over their own words. And perhaps there is no greater example than this clip.
The Commission may consider, along with the municipalities, regional and rural communities that are, for example, situated near major urban centers. One of the best examples of this, for example, might be the close proximity of Chestermere or St. Albert to
the close proximity of Chestermere or St. Albert to Edmonton. The close proximity of Chestermere or St. Albert to Edmonton. I feel like if you're going to try to wink, wink, nudge, nudge, give the Commission directions in regards to how maps should be drawn, you should at least be able to locate the city of Chestermere and its close proximity to Edmonton, if that's what you want to do. Moving on from there. One of the other pieces that's introduced in this omnibus bill has to do with the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. Now, the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act is famously a piece of Jason Kenney legislation that he brought in after Indigenous and First Nations peoples started to blockade infrastructure. There were some railroad tracks in Edmonton that got blocked and traffic areas that got blocked, and people really didn't like that. And so Jason Kenney campaigned on bringing forward legislation that would make certain areas off limits. Super big penalties if you go into any of these areas. And the legislation was very broadly worded. So there were certain areas that were clearly defined, but there was also sort of this broad scope of, and anything else that the province designates as critical infrastructure. Nonetheless, with multiple contracts and contract negotiations that aren't going very well, by the way, there's been an amendment made to the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act, and it's important to talk about because it now brings in the definition of hospitals or chartered surgical facilities as defined in the Health Facilities Act, a continuing care home as defined in the Continuing Care Act, a facility designated under the Mental Health Act, an ambulance, a dispatch center, or any building structure or mobile facility used to provide emergency health services under the Emergency Health Services Act. Now, this is where it gets kind of dumb because, first of all, they already had the power to do all of that. They already had the power to say any piece of infrastructure is a critical piece of infrastructure. La, 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 we told you so. That power existed within the act. It's also important to realize that any of the things that are listed off here are also considered to be private property. They're not public lands to begin with. This is why you're not allowed to film inside of hospitals because it's private property. This is why anytime you see any sort of healthcare protest done by nurses or anybody who works in healthcare, they will be off the hospital property because it's private property. These rules already exist. And there's no examples that we could find unless you go to the anti-vax, anti-mask folks, where people infringed on that private property and broke the rules that were in place on that private property. So the only reason to put this sort of legislation in is to flex on the healthcare organizations that are currently in negotiations with the province of Alberta. And it's a pretty bold move because, again, the rules are already in place. Protests, you take a look at any of the protests that happen with nurses or any other healthcare worker, they're always on the sidewalks outside on the public land. It's a pretty chilling thing for the provincial government to do. Moving on from there, I'm trying to move quick so we have lots of time for our open mic tonight. We got to talk about the police funding freeze, because this is a fascinating little game of which cup is the ball under? Which cup is the ball under? See if you can follow it. See if you can follow it. Because the province took a victory lap over pausing the funding regulation. And it gets complicated because on its face, it sounds like, oh, look at that. The provinces are giving the provinces giving municipalities a break on the cost of policing. That's sure nice of them. Except that charge was brought in by the UCP in 2020. It was a new funding model. It was supposed to be phased in over several years, with rural municipalities paying an increasing share of their policing costs each year. It was supposed to reach 30% by 2023. They were charged 10% starting in April 1st, 2020. This increased to 15% 1 year later, 20% to the following year, and finally 30% starting April 1st, 2023. Now, they said that they were going to have to increase it. After 2025, the municipal share will be required to be based on current policing costs, resulting in a proposed 39% increase in the cost of municipalities. So they're freezing it at the current level as opposed to kicking it up. 1 year moratorium. But again, it's a bit of a weird gift because this is a fee that didn't exist prior to 2020. Now, when it was introduced by saying, hey, you know what? Rural policing, oh, so bad. So much crime, out of control. We need more police. Guess we have to pay for them somehow, rural. We're going to get you to do it. And so, in effect, the province used municipalities to subsidize the cost of increasing an RCMP presence in rural Alberta. And they were going to gradually increase that over time. So let's be very clear about what's been happening since 2020. Since 2020, the provincial government has made the choice to make policing more expensive for municipalities. Hey, does that coincide in any way with any sort of consultation that the UCP was doing about provincial policing? And does that coincide in any way with the province trying to roll out a provincial police force? Gosh, I think it does. And so it is very much a bait and switch, because the provincial government created a way that they could charge municipalities for more policing, and they've been ratcheting the costs up to almost untenable levels because, again, as we talked about earlier in the program, the RMA, Rural Municipalities of Alberta, says many municipalities are going to be bankrupt in 5 to 10 years. So the province says, hey, you know what? This fee that we're charging, it's a real nice shop, that nice town you got there. Be a real shame if something happened to it. We're going to give you a little break for a year, but we're going to see you in a year. Sound familiar? One of the other big stories that has been going around has to do, I know there's been so much legislative work that they've done. They've just turned the fire hose on. One of the other things that the province did was they made some changes to FOIP, or the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, using Bills 33 and 34. The way that they're trying to do it is they're going to break the Freedom of Information Act into two separate acts. And there's some changes that are problematic. And a lot of people there's a lot of concern that goes on with these changes. So let's run through what a couple of the changes are real quick. The big changes are the bill is exempting communications between political staff and ministers as not disclosable. Now that's problematic because some of the communication that we've received over the years through our FOIPs absolutely would have fallen into that category. Some of the stories that we've shared that fortunately real journalists have by and large picked up on, we wouldn't have been able to share if we hadn't got that information through the FOIP process. It gets particularly problematic because the bill doesn't define who political staff are. So if you don't define what a political staff is, anybody who's conceivably on the government payroll and giving any kind of political advice could be considered political staff. Now, obviously, that's the most extreme interpretation, but do I need to play the clip about Danielle Smith saying the Sovereignty Act was just like a notwithstanding clause again? The disassembly of guardrails is a very real problem in the province of Alberta right now. Because as soon as you disassemble the guardrails, it's very, very clear that we have a political class that is more than happy to drive all over them. One of the other problems that happens with this legislation is the bill also changes the timeline around receiving requests from 30 calendar days to 30 business days. And that gets problematic really, really quickly. Right now, when we file a FOIP request, we have to get a response within 30 days. And every once in a while, they'll say, oh, it's so complicated and we need approvals. So we're going to extend it to 60. And there's a mechanism for them to do that. But by changing it to business days, you've added at least 8 to 16 days, depending on when the FOIP request is made, assuming there's no holidays, which is not increasing transparency. And it's not increasing the ability for members of the public to make demands about the kind of accountability that they want to see from a provincial government. And again, this is yet another example of the UCP acting in incredibly bad faith, because they sold this bill as being, we're increasing transparency and we're going to give people the opportunity to disclose more. Yeah, because that's a theme that we've seen. Going back to the Skybox scandal, journalists, real journalists, have been chasing down ministers and their staff for literally half a year, trying to get a list of who's all been going and hanging out with Skybox Sam Raish. The government has not been proactively disclosing anything. Moving on from there and getting close to the tail end of our program before we get to, I'm plowing through it tonight because I really want to make sure that we have the space for an open mic if anybody wants to tap in. We got to talk about the Aimco situation because this is complicated. It's really complicated. So let's walk through kind of what happened. On November 7th, Nate Horner, and the version of the events that we've gotten, is that the Aimco leadership team were having like a team building meeting, which is not unusual in corporate circles, to be clear. And Nate Horner showed up, all man in black style, and said, hey guys, great meeting. You're all fired. Thanks. Obviously paraphrasing a little bit, and we haven't been able to confirm the accuracy of that account. But that's basically what we've been told happens. And where it gets really crazy is Aimco is supposed to be an arm's length organization from government. Again, like the Electoral Commission that draws the boundaries and the MLA thingers. That's supposed to be something that is separate from government. But as we heard from Mickey Amory's rhetoric, certainly very clearly trying to influence the decisions of that committee, Nate Horner fired everybody on the board and appointed Nate Horner as the sole director and the chair of Aimco until a new board is appointed within 30 days. The next day, it was reported that longtime bureaucrat Ray Gilmore had been appointed to be the new CEO of Aimco after former CEO Evan Siddall was fired. And this is where some nuance gets to be important, because we have some independence problems here, because now we have Nate Horner being the president and the whole board for at least 30 days. We have the board being refocused as per the province of Alberta. And we don't really have a big conversation going on about how much money people are making and how much money is actually being managed here. Now, the government of Alberta did a very good job in releasing this infographic where they said, in 2019, the salary and the wages and the benefit costs were $129.7 million. In 2023, they went up to $223 million. That's a 71% change. They added another 135 employees. They managed to source out some of the funds being handled externally. So instead of 82% of the funds being managed internally, 67 are now being managed externally. So, hey, why does it cost so much money? Why is Aimco spending all of this money on salaries? And before I do the next bet, I want to be really, really clear. I don't personally believe anyone should make more than $1 million a year. I think once you've made $1 million of a year, congratulations, you've won. Go build a school or a hospital or something. Do something to make the world a better place as opposed to just sitting on stacks of cash. My personal opinion. That being said, when we talk about the financial sector, when we talk about the investment sector, people make, I would argue, unforgivable amounts of money for doing their jobs. And this context was highlighted really, really well by the Globe and Mail in a follow-up story that they did, where they pointed out overall costs and executive compensation for Aimco are comparable to many of its large Canadian peers. So the big salaries that everybody was making was comparable. The country's next largest pension fund, Ontario Municipal Retirement System, had a cost ratio of 54 basis points last year and 60 basis points the year before. The Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, which manages $452 billion in assets, had a ratio of 59 basis points in 2023. Now we get into the salaries. Mr. Siddall, the CEO, was just fired, made just under $4.6 million in direct compensation in 2023, plus more than $400,000 in pensions, benefits, other compensation, and a payout from a special award made in 2021, the year he became CEO. Those numbers all sound huge. Oh my gosh, that dude got paid $4.6 million. Can you believe it? So much money. And again, I want to be really, really clear. Nobody should make that much money. But the Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System CEO Blake Hutchison, who managed a fund with less assets, made nearly $5.8 million in total compensation. So to be really, really clear, if you want top-tier talent to work in your area, you have to pay them top-tier money. And if you have not top-tier talent, you likely won't see the same results that you would from top-tier talent and top-tier money. And it's gross. I want to be so clear about that. I don't think anybody should be making $4.6 million or $5.8 million in a year. That's ludicrous. But the Alberta CEO of Aimco was making less than a comparable fund, actually a smaller fund in Ontario, by almost 25%, 20%. So to say, oh, the salaries were out of control, it's so bad, is at the very least a little bit disingenuous. And there's a lot of concerns that have been raised over the reasons for why this restructuring has happened. Because one of the things that Danielle Smith has said in her pitch for the Alberta pension plan is, hey, what if we had Aimco manage it? So now all of a sudden, we see a complete gutting of Aimco. And it's just business as usual. Nothing to see here. Don't worry about it. It's definitely questionable. Because again, bad faith. Got a couple of fun little bookenders before we open up the mic. Because we're gonna have some. Before these new FOIP rules get in, we're gonna and you know, I gotta say the support that we've gotten from people since we did the Skybox episode, and I want to be really clear, like one of those every 6 months. The amount of work that goes into producing an episode like that would make your eyeballs bleed. I know, because mine nearly did, and some of the researchers on the show, I'm certain that theirs did. So thank you to everybody who signed up to be a Patreon sponsor and everybody who's contributed to our FOIP fund and our operational funds and all of that. Thank you so much. But I just really want to manage expectations. Not all of our shows will be that. But we've got some show ideas, and we wanted to share some of them with you in advance, because on the face of it, it looks like we're probably going to have us a little bit of fun. Some of you might remember how we started this year, where we did our whole deep dive on a certain content creation outlet, the Western Standard. Because one of the things that the Western Standard and content creators of their ilk like to brag about is the fact that, they don't take any of those big media subsidies. They don't touch any of that federal media money. They're not like the CBC. They can't be controlled by government. I'm personally really proud of that episode. If you haven't listened to it, you definitely should, because it was so much fun. But that's part of their pitch. We can't be influenced by government, so we can't take any government money. And in that episode, we proved that while the Western Standard may not be taking federal money, they sure don't seem to have any qualms about taking provincial money, because the Western Standard has run multiple ad campaigns that they've been paid an undisclosed amount for by the province of Alberta. So they're getting their funding in part from the provincial government. We proved all of that. We asked the Western Standard to comment. They did not. So there's that. But there were a lot of people when we were talking about, like, hey, this seems weird. The Western Standard's got all of these Government of Alberta ads going on their website. Seems kind of sketchy. What's going on there? There were a lot of people who were like, it's a nothing burger. It's probably just automatically generated. And we proved that's not how the Government of Alberta does business. So you can only imagine how excited we were when we came across a link from another content creating website. And this time we're talking about Angry Caillou's, Cian Bexty, his little website, The Counter Signal. Because if you go to The Counter Signal, you will see that they are running multiple ads for the province of Alberta. Better income, better jobs, better cost of living, public service. It's better here. Then they also run an ad for Ottawa's energy production cap will make groceries more expensive. Stopthecap.ca. So to be clear, these are multi-million-dollar advertising campaigns that the province launched. And we're not saying that all of the money went to the Counter Signal. We're not suggesting that. I want to be really, really clear about that. Because it's provable that there's other places that got some of that sweet advertising campaign money. How do we know? So far, we're pretty sure, at least, because our good friends at the Western Standard are running ads for Alberta's energy production cap. Means job losses. Scrapthecap.ca. They've also got the exact same public sector service ads for the Government of Alberta. So at this point, you have to know we filed some FOIPs. And we're eagerly awaiting the results, because it sure looks like part of what the provincial government is doing when it's placing these ads is it's using a not insignificant, just speculating here, amount to funnel money to some of their favorite media darlings. These same favorite media darlings who don't ever take government money, except when they do from the provincial government for advertising. Now, where this gets really awkward is if it turns out, and we'll do a full episode on this, you have to know, if it turns out that the province of Alberta has been funneling advertising money to Angry Caillou and the Counter Signal, then that raises some very interesting questions in regards to how Mr. Bexty has behaved, because on multiple occasions, he's gone to the private residence and the vacation spots of the Prime Minister and harassed the Prime Minister. And if he's been getting money from the province of Alberta that's in any way funding any of those activities, oh gosh, that gets awkward real quick, because that would mean that the province of Alberta is, in effect, funding the harassment of the Prime Minister of Canada. Wouldn't that be spicy? We'll let you know when we get those FOIP results. But before we open it up to the open mic, if there's anybody who wants to tap in tonight, and it looks like we've already got one. Before we open it up to the open mic, there's one other thing that I wanna plug. I want to talk about. We said on our social medias that we were turning the fire hose on this week. We are going to continue running the fire hose. We've got this episode. Obviously, this is, if you're listening to it or watching it, you already know that. But we are returning to the parental rights conversation because this is a foundational argument for Danielle Smith and a lot of her policies that she's bringing forward, that it has been clearly identified. She may very well have to invoke the notwithstanding clause, again, that I'm going to trample all over your human rights clause in order to bring into effect. So I am so excited to share this, and we have this one in the can. We're going to be sharing it on Thursday. I have been trying to get an interview with this guest for so long, and we were finally able to make it happen. We're going to be presenting a conversation on parental rights and on the implications of Danielle Smith's legislation, in particular with regards to the notwithstanding clause. This conversation is going to be, if you want to understand what parental rights are, he said cautiously, because they're not really a thing, and aren't in Canada. And if you want to understand what the notwithstanding clause is and how much of a nuclear option it should be viewed as, this is a conversation you absolutely don't want to miss, because we sit down with Florence Ashley, who is an associate professor of law at the University of Alberta, and we go through the nuts and bolts of this thing. And it really should be giving everybody pause that the Premier of Alberta is even entertaining the idea of invoking a clause that literally says, I'm going to just trample all over your human rights. That's the only reason this clause exists. It really should be giving everybody pause. And it's also worth highlighting that this is not the only subject that she's threatened to use the notwithstanding clause on. She has come out publicly on the record in recordings and said that she'll use it to get around her forced treatment. So this is not just the trans conversation for everybody who is maybe feeling tired of the trans conversation. You can be tired of it if you want. I can only imagine what it feels like to be a trans person in this province and being punched down by the highest order of government that exists in this province. I can only imagine how tired they are, which is why we've made the commitment here that as long as Danielle Smith is talking about this, we're going to be talking about it. As long as the legal challenges are going on, we're going to be talking about it. And you better believe in the show notes, there is the link where you can donate to some of the legal challenges, because it's so gross. But before we get to the open mic, there's one more clip that I want to share, because this was shared with us, and we're going to give you the slightly abridged version. It's available on all of our socials. This was put forth by somebody who is directly impacted by the policies that Smith is pursuing. And it is a cutting juxtaposition that demonstrates the reality of who Danielle Smith is, who she says she is, and who she claims to be.
I had a constituent who called me because her transgendered son had wanted to start up a gay-straight alliance in the school that he was in Claresholm, and was told no. And that has stayed with me for a year, since I've been wondering what happened to that child and being shut down by the adults in that school. You never have to feel alone or isolated. If you do, reach out to your parents, family members, teachers, a coach, or other trusted adults, and ask for support. I've since been able to visit GSA clubs and talk to the kids who benefit from them. And what the kids told them is, we're accepted by our peers. It's the adults who don't accept us. We, as the adults in your life, will be there for you. And that, I think, is why we have to really understand, at what point does a mature youth have the ability to make their own decisions about their sexuality that doesn't involve their parents. their sexual activities and preferences, and many other adult choices. So we recognize that a child as young as 12 can choose which parent they want to live with. For a minor, age 15 and under, the government will require parental notification and consent for a school to alter the name or pronouns of a child. At age 16, they can become emancipated from their parents to make entire education decisions on their own. For 16 and 17-year-olds who choose to alter their name or pronouns, where they really have the ability and right to be able to make their own decisions. Parents do not need to give consent about the kind of support that they feel that they need to feel accepted, but they must be notified. And that to me is what GSA clubs are about. The children that I met with who were at these GSA clubs, most of them, their parents didn't know that they were out yet. We know that nearly all parents, even those who may disagree with the decision of their children, will love and care for their children no matter what choices they make. Most of them knew that if their parents knew, that there'd be some consequences to that. Will love and care for their children no matter what choices they make. Another young boy told me that he came out to his parents and his dad rejected him. No matter what choices they make. Another young woman was beaten by her father. No matter what choices they make. So while I respect that we need to find a balance with parental rights and with religious freedom, I think we need to also respect that in the case of these mature youths, this really is a case of life or death. We, as the adults in your life, will be there for you to make sure you know just how amazing and precious you are. Thank you for listening.
Hard to add anything to that. The only thing that I'll say to highlight before we pivot to the open mic, I know Ziad's in the queue waiting, is Danielle Smith knows right from wrong. She knows in 2014 how much harm could be inflicted on vulnerable kids, and she's selling them out. And so the question that any UCP supporter who defines themselves by oil and gas or by religious alignment or religious beliefs or whatever your identity thing is, if she was moved to tears in the legislature and 10 years later she's selling those kids out when she knows it's wrong, why would you think for a second that she won't sell you out? With that, we're going to pivot to the live conversation. I'm going to hope that this works and that I can bring Ziad in, because it's been like 2 months since we've had an open mic. Ziad, how are you doing tonight, sir?
Fine, thanks, Nate. Yeah, I haven't spoken on this basis in a long time either, so can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you really good. Fortunately, it appears that the tech, for the time being, still works. I don't know what we're going to do when Twitter completely self-immolates. I hope that Blue Sky figures out how to do spaces or something comparable.
Yeah. And while I'm thinking, I'm usually listening to you on YouTube because there hasn't been a phone-in. But just for those people watching on YouTube, don't forget to like this show, subscribe to this, and also turn on your notifications so you can catch the Breakdown AB when it comes up. I just wanted to say, Wildrose Danielle Smith would really kick the butt of UCP Danielle Smith. And it's unfortunately she was a little opportunistic. She destroyed her career as a Wildrose person by destroying half the opposition, taking it over to the ruling PC party, and then causing them to lose to the NDP. So, she only wasn't so mercenary and opportunistic and stuck to her principles. Wildrose Danielle Smith would give UCP Danielle Smith quite a run for her money.
That's the thing that's wild to me, because if there's anybody in this province who should have learned the lessons of you have to have guardrails to protect you from doing dumb things, one would think Danielle Smith would be the person to have learned those lessons with the most opportunity, but that's not the case. So
It's a special kind of person that uses the phrase notwithstanding clause as much as she does. That's certainly someone now who has the power of the majority and wants to push around minorities.
You're not
Because
wrong.
that's really what a notwithstanding clause by definition is.
Yep.
I had about a minute and a half to 2 minutes of notes on Aimco and a minute and a half to 2 minutes of notes on MH Care Medical and Vanch. So I can do one or the other or both. You let me know whichever is first or only.
You could do both, sir. Absolutely.
Okay. So let's talk Aimco first. Aimco seems to have very inconvenient timing. So around 2021 was around the time that the Alberta Teachers Pension Plan was forcibly put under Aimco, and the and the rights of the teachers to choose their investment manager was taken away. Also around 2021, when Aimco had $3 to $4 billion of loss on high volatility trading tools, and they fired their CEO then, Ken Ubelin. And they also made a number of board and executive changes. So here we are 3 years later, and Aimco's being inconvenient again with poor performance and cost. And back then in 2021, Kenny was hinting that Aimco might be the APP provider. And now in 2024, Daniel Smith and Nate Horner are having to sort of talk down the fact that Aimco was the APP provider to be. Just for reference, the 10-year performance of the CPP, after all expenses net, is 9.1%. And for Aimco, it's 7.2%. So when you're looking at 10, 20, 30-year horizons for a pension, that 2% difference is huge.
Oh, for sure.
And I just wanted to say lastly on Aimco, if you look at their webpage, in their news, the only news they have is that an interim CEO was appointed, and they just gave the name Ray Gilmore, no mini bio. So it's contradictory to all their previous news announcements when board or management changes. They say who's going out, thank them very much, wish them a good life, who's coming in, and a bio on them. The other thing that's missing is there's nothing about the board being replaced with a finance minister. So as much as Aimco likes to talk about governance, and all over their webpage they talk about governance and trust us, and we have this independent relationship with the Alberta government. It's funny, they haven't announced that independent relationship with the board and a governance policy and structure just got destroyed by having the minister control it directly and appoint that interim CEO. So a lot of hypocrisy there in the governance supposedly provided by the new finance minister, and he's not even admitting to the public that he's now in charge and replaced the CEO. So that was what I had on Aimco. If you had any questions there, I can answer them. Otherwise, I'll move on to MHK Medical.
No, I always love to hear about MH Care.
Okay. I don't know if you've heard of them. I watched a show a couple of weeks ago where, this middle-aged guy with scary-looking tattoos did a kick-butt job in representing some teamwork on that.
Well, there was a lot of teamwork on that. I don't want to, for 1 second, have anyone try to say Nate did the best job on that, because it was absolutely a team effort, and I respect fully the fact that we have members of the team who have to maintain their anonymity. But I thank you, but I want to be super, super clear. There's a lot of people who did a lot of heavy lifting to make that episode a reality.
Yeah, I could tell. And, you were putting your face out front to be the lightning rod for any counterattacks that come for a lot of people. Like I put myself out there, I put a lot of research in my threads, and some of that I saw in your show, either from my threads or from your other sources, but there was a lot there I didn't know and I learned from it. So, yeah, good job to the team, and thank you for being the snowplow in the front. It's kind of like having an older sibling who was naughty with the parents, going out late or drinking or partying a lot. The older sibling is the snowplow for the younger kids.
It's true. What do you have on MH Care?
So I've confirmed that MH Care Medical has been the importer of several crop products. The Vanch masks we knew from looking at the medical, Health Canada's medical device serious incident forms. We have the BYD KN95s now confirmed. We knew about the Atabay acetaminophen imports. And we're also seeing some other PPE that's been failing and reported in the Health Canada medical device incident database, such as couple of different pairs of gloves that were splitting, rupturing, and causing bodily fluid issues. I have hundreds of pages of FOIP that were received by certain healthcare workers in 2021. And I'd looked at them before, but I didn't really have time then to get to them to take care of some family matters. I'll be coming to those soon. And similar to your offer to real journalists, I'll be offering those, I think it's about 1,000 pages altogether of FOIP responses that the government of Alberta has provided to healthcare workers that made FOIP requests. And some of the more difficult or troubling aspects of those FOIP requests is more of the government of Alberta lying for or covering for MH Care Medical's incompetence or poor quality. And that's been a trend. It's MH Care Medical incompetence, poor quality imports, but the government of Alberta lying about those products and falsely ascribing higher quality to them, or covering up their unsafe aspects. So, for example, there's one FOIP response where the government suppressed the material safety or the safety data sheet, which, if you know from WMIS, is a legal requirement to provide to your employees. And they suppressed the safety data sheet, and they also suppressed skin and toxicology results that MH Care explicitly mailed to the government of Alberta saying, here's this stuff. And this was happening around the same time as graphene and other products were being caught in masks, and also the same time as healthcare workers right from the beginning were complaining about skin rashes, etc. So for the Alberta government to suppress those and claim that it's commercial interest of a third party is total BS. Also, I think it's either Section 16 or 17 of the FOIP Act. Under that, the government, if they're going to disclose information to the public that might compromise the interests of a third party, they have to notify the third party and give the third party a chance to make a representation within 30 days, saying, no, don't give that up, and here's why. And then when the government discloses the FOIP, they're supposed to say, we can't give you this from this corporation because this is their reasoning and this is our acceptance of that reasoning, or we agreed in these areas, but we disagreed in those areas. GOA did not provide an explanation why they suppressed SDS, skin, and toxicity. And yeah, this bothers me because my parents were in long-term care. I know personally healthcare aides that showed me, they lifted their mask away and they showed me the rash and the irritation they had on their skin. And they told me about having to go from their family doctor to now a dermatology specialist and trying to figure out what the heck is wrong with these badge masks. And here GOA had the information, was suppressing it. There's also another section, I think it's Section 24 or Section 30 of the FOIP Act, where if there's a matter there of public health, public safety, risk to safety, it has to be disclosed, even if the corporation owning it, or owning that product with the information to be disclosed doesn't want it to be disclosed. It has to be. So that's something I'll be revealing in the coming weeks as I get time. Also, I sent a tweet out earlier this week, I think Saturday or Sunday on the weekend, about the medical device incidents that Health Canada has a record of from the Vance mask reports. And those are only about 1/8 to 1/10 of what the government of Alberta knows. So in the government of Alberta FOIP disclosure, they show about 1,000, if I remember correctly, about 1,000 cases where they know about injury or irritation to workers from those masks. But only about 150 to 200 show up in the Health Canada database. And all of it is supposed to. Within 30 days, hospitals are supposed to report, health organizations are supposed to report these issues to Health Canada. But the government, when they introduced those Vance masks in April 2020, set up an email address of an alternate reporting method for people to email ppe@ahs.ca. And you can see in the FOIP responses, dozens and dozens, hundreds of healthcare workers complaining to ppe@ahs.ca saying, I'm having this rash, we're having this irritation. I'm the occupational health nurse or the occupational health specialist for this work group. We're having all these problems, the ear loops are snapping, the stuff's falling off our nose. And they might not get a response for months. And when they do get a response, it's a sorry for being late and maybe report it to My Safety Net, which is sort of like the workplace health and safety harassment complaint line within AHS, the database within AHS, but it's not the Health Canada database where it's supposed to by law go. And that happened over and over and over again. So I'll be doing that. I might do it by Twitter. If you feel like dabbling with MH Care again, I might put together some slides and see if you have time on the show, and I'll present some of these FOIP violations in a presentation on your show if you have time.
Yeah, I'd definitely be up for that. I mean, one of the things I think you'd probably be very interested in is we have gotten a few tips since we did the Skybox episode in regards to the fact that it wasn't just the masks, and in fact, we have a few pictures that I have to make sure that we're allowed to show. That we've been sent of not just masks rotting away in storage, but also allegedly a bunch of gowns rotting away in storage, and the gloves that you were just referring to there. So send us a DM and we'll get something coordinated, man.
Yeah, will do. Thank you. And so Saturday or Sunday this week, I provided a link to the Health Canada Medical Device Incident Database, searching explicitly on MH Care. I've got 289 results, so people can look for that in my Twitter threads and remind themselves of more MH Care medical products to look for at Alberta Health. Take pictures, send them to you, send them to me. It's all good.
Awesome. Thanks, Ziad.
Thanks very much for the time.
Yeah, thank you. You have a great night. I think you might be
You
our
too.
only speaker tonight because the Twitter purge is real. So I'm going to take this opportunity to do all the plugs and all of the things. And then we're going to wrap it up for the night at less than 2 hours, no less. And so, yeah, there we go. I'm going to do the plugs. I mentioned it earlier, but I want to clarify again. So much of what we're able to do at the show here is because of the support that we get from our the people who see value in the kind of content that we're trying to create. There's a bunch of different ways you can help support us. One of them is through our Patreon at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab. Another way that you can help us to continue to produce the kind of content that we do is sending e-transfers. You can e-transfer to info@thebreakdownab.ca. All of this information is in the show notes. So if you have the financial means, and if you don't have the financial means, then as Ziad said there, you can do the liking, you can do the subscribing, you can follow us on the Blue Sky because we're on there now too, with a more regular presence because it seems like half of our audience has already migrated to Blue Sky. And we may or may not have picked up a couple of extra Blue Sky handles that are super fun that we might be revealing over the coming weeks. But yeah, if you have the financial means, that's one way you can do it. Another way you can help support us is by going to abpoli.ca. We do have all of our merch there, including the toques. I was going to wear mine tonight. I totally forgot. I apologize. I will wear it for our next live show. I will get warm because they're very, very warm, but I will wear it for our next live show. And I think that's pretty much it. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight. Thank you, everybody, if you're listening to the podcast version. Thank you if you're watching the video version. Thanks for everybody who's been in the chat there. See somebody already. I was going to make sure I made a note to go back to the chat because somebody was asking for Ziad's Twitter handle and like people are already up in there. So I love the little community that we have in our chat. It's so delightful. And we very, very rarely have to like ban anyone. It's fantastic. So thanks to everybody in the chat. All of that being said, I got one other clip. You know what it is that I want to play before I do the final wrap up.
How's your BS detector evolved over time?
I tend to be pretty trusting.
Never gets old. Never gets old. I love that clip so much. Fills my cup up. I really want to say, and I know that I'm like, oh guys, we got the greatest episode coming up. The conversation with Florence Ashley, oh my gosh, you should listen to it, and you should and watch it and share it, because the amount of misinformation that exists in regards to what the notwithstanding clause is, what parental rights are or aren't, who's actually got the rights in all of these conversations that we're having, the amount of misinformation and disinformation that is disseminated, regrettably, by the provincial government and media is really, really harmful. It is poisoning the conversation. It is poisoning the discourse. And Dr. Ashley does a amazing job of just laying it all out there. So, like I said, that's going to go up for our Patreon supporters tomorrow. It will go up on for everybody else on Thursday. We will be back on Sunday with another live show, another open mic for anybody who wants to brave the Twitter waters and call in, raise your hand on the Twitter Spaces. And we'll be back then. In the meantime and in between time, as always, take breaks, take breathers. I really am liking the whole, I hate that I am saying this, but I'm really liking the whole blue sky experience. Probably just got deleted off of Twitter for saying that, but it's pretty awesome. So take breaks, have positive conversations, but above all else, as always, keep the conversation going.